Thanks. So I'm recording this. I do that for my students and some colleagues that like to see what's going on. This is part of a larger project that I've been working on for a while. I'm writing a book on Aristotle and anger that works across the corpus. And one of the issues that comes up over and over again in discussing Aristotelian virtue ethics is this problem of what is prohairesis actually. Like a lot of things in Aristotle, the more that you dig into it and the more that you look at the commentators who are digging into it, the murkier it gets. You'd expect that there'd always be, everything would like fall into place. That isn't the case for this concept, at least. So I'm going to just read the paper. You've got handouts sort of summarizing. What exactly is the moral phenomenon Aristotle picks out in his works by Prohairesis? Interpreters of Aristotle head in several diverging directions. For some, Prohairesis remains an unproblematic concept, whose entire nature and scope we understand well enough from its Nicomachean Ethics book 3.2 characterization as deliberate choice. For others, Aristotle's conception of prohairesis is not quite so simple, clear, or straightforward. Without simply rejecting the Nicomachean Ethics 3.2 discussion, such interpreters sense that those passages cannot comprise the entirety of the story. Some suspect that a deep incoherence or lacuna underlies Aristotle's numerous discussions and uses of the term. Others attempt to rework an Aristotelian notion of prohairesis into something more amenable, because more like to, conceptions germane to later moral theories, like the turn into the will, for example. Others more optimistically attempt to provide more or less integrated and systematic interpretations ranging across Aristotle's corpus. The challenge for these, the latter, is to rightly knot the threads from Aristotle's writings together in ways that are faithful to the text and harmonious with the larger structure of Aristotle's moral theory, and yet contribute some additional understanding. My own interpretation, in my view, solidly places me within this last camp. Understandably, some might regard my advocacy of a more extensive and robust conception of prohairesis as exemplifying imaginative shoehorning of Aristotle's moral theories into confines of other later moral theories. It's going to look a lot like some conceptions of the will. In this short paper, I'll first briefly present what I call a standard interpretation of Aristotelian prohairesis centered on Nicomachean Ethics 3.2. Second, I'll bring together some, though not all, of the other passages from the Aristotelian corpus in which prohairesis is discussed. Third, I'll suggest that implications of these passages raise problems for the standard interpretation, and I'll propose an alternate, more expansive interpretation of prohairesis along lines suggested by the additional passages. For reasons of convenience and consistency, I'm going to render prohairesis here as choice. There's all sorts of problems with how to translate it exactly, and there's also problems given that different translators have not been consistent across the English renderings. Due to limitations of length, I don't provide an account as full as that of the longer study I'm presently working on, and I relegate portions of the argument and discussion to footnotes, which is how I tend to get around the reading time requirement. So this is the standard interpretation. One would understandably expect Aristotle's most definitive and determinative treatment of prohairesis to occur in Nicomachean Ethics 3.2, particularly given the pains he takes distinguishing it from other moral phenomena, and the fact that he finally asks, what is it, and what sort of thing is it? His answer is that it's a subset of the voluntary, that is preceded by deliberation, since it does, as he says, involve reason and thought. This aspect of involving reasoning and deliberation is particularly important, explaining why, according to Aristotle, animals and children do not yet possess it. Animals lack and children do not yet possess it. He also makes a broader etymological point, namely that the very name signifies that it involves choosing one thing over another or before another or others. So choice gets characterized as intrinsically comprising deliberation, boule or bouleausis, whose nature Aristotle examines in the following chapter, specifying its concern only with determining means for ends, not in assessing, comparing, or ordering ends themselves. Other passages reinforce this connection, particularly the characterization as deliberating desire, or affectivity, depending on how you want to translate orexis, about matters that are up to us. And his clarification that what is deliberated about and what chosen are the same, except that what is chosen has already been determined, since the chosen is selected as a result from the process of deliberation. So the examples in these two chapters seem to bear out choice's intrinsic connection with deliberation. For example, when he maintains it cannot be rational desire, Prohairesis, since we rationally desire ends but choose only means for those ends. It thus seems reasonable to follow certain translators in rendering Prohairesis as deliberate choice. What other key passages figure in this standard interpretation? Certainly Aristotle's definitions of virtue as such. In Nicomachean Ethics 2, we learn that virtuous action proceeds from deliberate choice, and that virtue is a state expressive of such choice. In fact, virtue and vice lie within our power as states we develop through actions, and thus we are morally responsible for them, precisely because it lies within our choice to engage in actions characteristic and productive of virtue or of vice. Again, in Nicomachean Ethics 6.2, choice gets brought in close parallel with deliberation and gets called deliberative desire, and is framed both as the determinative starting point, the arche of actions, and is informed in its turn by desire or affectivity and reasoning towards some end. Passages in the Nicomachean Ethics, the Eudemian Ethics, and the De Anima consistently construe lack of self-control, or krasia, as failure to abide by one's deliberate choice faced with desire's demands, and self-control as sticking with one's resolve. So what is prohairesis on this account? It's voluntary, it's choice made between alternatives, it's informed by deliberation, selecting means to some end desired as good. It's closely connected with, though distinguishable from, other more important moral phenomena. An ambiguity has to be noted, though, because prohairesis denotes not only individual choices made on particular occasions, but also broader, longer-lasting, more characteristic patterns of choice. If this were not the case, it would make no sense to regard virtue and vice as prohairetic. One deliberates about and then chooses what will move one towards one's determinate end in specific situations, but one also deliberates on a higher level about what will move one towards one overarching end, happiness or eudaimonia, whatever shape one has conceived it. And so, one may deliberate and then choose on lower situational or on higher global levels, well or poorly, rightly or wrongly, and be correspondingly praised or criticized for it and for the actions or omissions that follow from such deliberate choices. This seems a highly intellectualist account in which one must deliberate, that is, explicitly reason matters through all, or at least much of the time, in moral matters. To possess a good prohairesis, it seems that one must deliberate and choose rightly both at the lower, locally particularized level and at a higher, more global level of one's life and personality over time. Likewise, a bad prohairesis, whether as a single bad choice, a particular vicious disposition, or as the structure of one's entire personality, would equally seem to involve explicit deliberation determining means to a given and probably bad or misconceived end. So now the second section, other relevant passages. In Aristotle's works, people are morally evaluated specifically on the basis of choice. Unsurprisingly, the reasons Aristotle first adduces for thematically studying prohairesis in the discussion that we were just looking at is that it is so intimately connected with virtue and permits, as he says, better judging of people's characters than do actions. This makes sense, given that virtue and vice involve, express, and are reciprocally produced by and productive of prohairesis. In the Poetics, it's consistently tied to character, actions, and discourse, the latter of which reveal and embody prohairesis. It plays an important role in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics 8 and 9, treatment of friendship as well, where he says the return one should render to one's friend is based on their choice. For this in turn is determinative of the friend and of virtue. Rhetoric Book 1 also mentions acting in accordance with good choice as characteristic of a good person, and I actually put in a footnote one thing I do want to bring up. It's funny because in that one, Aristotle then goes on to cynically provide advice about how you might produce such an impression. So there's a certain vulnerability there, right? The association needn't necessarily be with good character, however. Aristotle distinguishes between the sophist and the dialectical philosopher precisely on the basis of their prohairesis in the rhetoric, the choice and intention exhibited by the use to which they turn argument. Interestingly, he says it's the sophist who acts in accordance with choice, whereas the dialectician acts in accordance with the discipline of argumentation, using it rightly, according to norms discernible within it. Speaking in more general terms about wrongdoing, Aristotle tells us that those who choose do so because of vice or lack of self-control. In distinguishing between degrees of wrongdoing and responsibility, whether a person actually chooses to do wrong plays an important role in Aristotle's views on how the act and the person ought to be treated. He says, for wrongdoing and vice reside in the choice, just as much as does genuine moral goodness. In fact, the very names of some classes denote their bad moral purpose. That's a translation of Prohairesis as well. So clearly, choice is a nexus and target for moral evaluation. What makes it good or bad? In Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6, Aristotle tells us, in order for the choice to be good, the rational faculty must be true, and the affectivity, the erexis, must be right, and the affectivity must respond accordingly to the things the rational faculty shows us. This is precisely what truth in action, or practical truth, concerned with practical or productive activity, consists in. There's a reciprocity on the part of the rational faculty, as well since the truth it possesses must itself accord with rightly structured affectivity. This juncture of practical intellect and affectivity is essential to Aristotle's conception of prohairesis, which is in fact where they meet and interfuse with or interfere with each other. He signals this interconnection of intellect and affectivity, or reason and desire, by stating, choice is either affectively imbued intellect or intellectually oriented affectivity, which is how I translate this passage, the words, choice is either erectikos nous or erexis dianoetike. Following this up, he emphasizes the near identity between the human being and their choice. In Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6:12, Aristotle tells us virtue rightly directs us towards ends, making the aim and in fact the prohairesis right. Practical wisdom or prudence, by contrast, ensures that the right means to the end are determined. The relation between these is in terms of means and ends, and thus prohairesis and deliberation and rational desire is not so simple or strictly dichotomous. Virtue, in the full sense, cannot exist without prudence. He says, not least because virtue is a state in accordance with prudence, that is, a state not only in accordance with right reason, but which is accompanied by it. He says, this is precisely why there cannot be right prohairesis without prudence, at least some degree of it, or without virtue, since these enable to rightly grasp and act in relation to both means and ends. This formulation must not be interpreted and applied in too strict a fashion, because the self-controlled and the uncontrolled person do possess a prohairesis that is more or less right, that is, along the lines of what virtue and prudence would dictate or produce, though not caused by the presence of virtue or prudence in the person. The self-controlled person remains in it or follows it, while the uncontrolled person does not do this, but does still recognize it, even regrets abandoning it. The vicious person, by contrast, remains in and acts according to choice. Their choices are skewed because they correspond with wrong starting points for action, that is, ends, since vice corrupts those. In fact, the mistaken moral choice of a vicious person partly consists in making the wrong things into ends. For instance, in the case of the self-indulgent person who pursues excesses of pleasures or pleasures excessively through their own choice, Aristotle says, for the sake of those very pleasures, not for the sake of anything else. So this brings us to a last important point in evaluating prohairesis. It's always determinatively oriented by some ends. In the process, grasping, realizing, even ordering matters as good and bad, understanding them under aspects of what we can call, broadly, moral values. Here I'll confine myself to noting three dimensions of this. First, Aristotle explicitly notes distinct but intersecting moral values as matters of prohairesis. For example, in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 3, where there are, he says, three sets of values of concern for moral choices and avoidances. The positive ranges are the noble, the kalon, the useful, or profitable, the sympheron, and the pleasant, the hedon. The negative are the base, the harmful, and the painful. Clearly to these we have to add the just and the unjust, the dikaion and adikon. Second, as the passage continues, the good person is likely to get these values right, and the bad person is likely to make mistakes. So in Nicomachean Ethics 3.4, the good person embodies a correct standard and judges accordingly when it comes to such matters, in particular about what is genuinely noble and pleasant. Aristotle focuses on hexis, that is their moral state, and Felician, their rational desire for ends perceived as goods, in that passage which is literally sandwiched between two connected discussions thematizing choice, the second of which argues that virtue and vice are voluntary because they express prohairesis, not because they express prohairesis, but because they are cumulatively produced by prohairesis. Third, if we go back to prohairesis' etymology, which involves the sense of taking or choosing, haire, and the sense of comparing and setting things overage, or the pro in it, we must now recognize that prohairesis is not just selection among possible means to previously given or rationally determined ends. It extends to ordering goods and values in relation to each other in ongoing practical life, a determinate relation of the person and their choices, moral habits, actions, even emotional responses, and relationships to what we can recognize as a hierarchy of values. So now the third section, expanding the standard interpretation. I don't want to say we get rid of it entirely. I just want to say we have to make room for further dimensions. So these brief peregrinations through Aristotle's text suggest an understanding of prohairesis incorporating but going beyond this standard interpretation. In this last section, I'd like to offer some outlines of what an expanded model would look like. My view as an interpreter of Aristotle is that his discussions of and references to prohairesis are understandably confusing because he didn't adequately distinguish different, though connected senses of the term, corresponding to different, analogically related sides of the phenomenon. So I intend this last section to do two interrelated things. One is to try to disentangle these senses from each other. The other is to suggest why the standard interpretation has to be challenged and expanded. So let's start with the latter. We've seen that prohairesis is a source for intentional human action and that it provides a locus for the moral evaluation of a person as well as their actions, moral habits or states, and structures of motivation and valuing. It provides a window into a person's character precisely because it is woven into it at so many points, inextricably connected with virtue and vice, desires and practical reasoning, ends and means, development or degeneration, even self-control or its lack. One of the key questions we have to ask is this: does prohairesis always, at every point, explicitly involve deliberation about means to given ends? Granted, in many cases, even many paradigmatic cases, it does. But is moral choice, what makes a person a good or bad person, always a matter of practical reasoning, setting before oneself some good understood as an end, examining the possible means, assessing and comparing them in terms of their own various goodnesses or badnesses, selecting one of them, perhaps even reasoning further about what means would best lead to that particular means? Is it only on such an intellectual basis that people do choose and act, establish or express their characters? When we say that a person is good or bad, that this goodness or badness is embodied in their choices, their motivations, their priorities, what they apparently desire and value? Or is the affective, habitual, and relational basis of moral life just as important, equally determinative in a person's choices? The choices that make him or her the kind of person he or she is. We might try to say that moral choice is always a matter of previously worked out deliberation, but we know this isn't the case. Alternately, we might construe it as involving deliberation in a more shadowy manner, perhaps hypothetically or counterfactually, or perhaps understood as a more implicit process. The good person can not only reason rightly about means and ends, but also is rightly oriented effectively in those manners and matters. So when it comes to moral preference, in the sense of, where it's cognate to prohairesis, the pre as opposed to the pro, the ferens, the hairesis, while the good person acts and chooses rationally, with right affectivity consonant to true reason, they often do so without any explicit process of practical reasoning. So there's good reason to decouple prohairesis from necessary connection with deliberation in a strict sense. What about means and ends? Is it true we deliberate solely about means, inquiring into, acquiring, determining, reevaluating ends only by other means? Is it true that our moral choice concerns only means, or do we ever call our ends into question, realize that we've been pursuing the wrong ends, guiding ourselves by them in reason, habit, feeling, and action? Do we ever decide upon the need for moral reformation, to right our already wrongly established course? Is this experience available to a strict Aristotelian? Certainly in a trivial sense, it is, because we can always displace the end and its considerations to a reconceptualized eudaimonia. We can always say, well, he just didn't know what eudaimonia really was. But in a more robust sense, again, we ought to ask, what are people morally praised and blamed for? Is it not, at least in part, for their very choice, their commitment to and conscious endorsement of ends, their orderings and prioritizations of goods, their hierarchies of value? The question remaining open is whether Aristotelian prohairesis can be extended to such extent of bearing upon at least some ends. The standard interpretation, I think, is to take Leibniz's famous phrase over, true in its affirmation but false in denial and restrictiveness. I propose that we view prohairesis as a complex and multi-layered phenomenon corresponding to an analogical term whose senses Aristotle does not rigorously distinguish, but he could. Go to Aristotelian grounds. At present, I would distinguish at least 3 different senses and levels of prohairesis. The first sense denotes particular, morally significant choices made by a person in specific circumstances, voluntary, most likely involving deliberation, exclusively about means to some extent. We ought to distinguish a second, wider sense, transcending but integrating individual choices so as to form an identifiable and specific pattern. This is where we have virtues and vices. Also self-control and its lack, at a level where deliberation will often, but not always, be involved. I would like to suggest that we also understand Aristotelian prohairesis at a third, more substantive level, the nexus of the moral person, a manifold of fundamental and either integrated or discordant attitudes, beliefs, choices, actions, and affectivity. I would further suggest that at this third global level of prohairesis, the person would be involved in and responsible for choice of their ends as well as means. Thank you. Yeah.
I have just a very quick clarification question, and this is going to reveal how unfamiliar I am with Aristotle's ethics. But is prohairesis something that we cultivate? Because you mentioned that animals and children don't possess it. And animals, I assume, could not cultivate it, but children will.
Children eventually acquire it. Aristotle's very unclear about how precisely this happens.
Okay.
We know that adults have it, and it can be good or bad in them. And children don't have it, and he never really talks about the
Okay, so if it's the case that the good person is likely to get moral questions right, and the bad person, conversely, is likely to get them wrong, I was just wondering if Aristotle ever says we can change our prohairesis, like, and we can adapt it, or can we get worse?
That's why it's so tempting to try to assimilate prohairesis in Aristotle's sense to something like the will that you see in Cicero or Augustine or later authors, where there's a reflexivity to it. Our prohaireses bear upon our prohairesis once we become conscious of that. Now, Epictetus, writing several hundred years after Aristotle, explicitly does that with the term prohairesis. And there's good reason to make a case for translating prohairesis and Epictetus as will.
Okay.
For Aristotle, it's not quite at that level yet. But it is where, it's where we make our choices. And I think we have to have a multi-layered account, or else we can't, what he's saying can't really add up. Now, Aristotle, unfortunately, didn't do that, but I think you could do that on good Aristotelian grounds. In a way, it's fortunate, because then we get to do it.
Yeah.
We have something to talk about.
And actually, just building on that, because as you were, when I had read your paper a couple of times, and your question prompted me to go right to a particular passage I think would help your interpretation. In book 3, chapter 5, 11:14a, where he's discussing when people get double penalties for being drunk, or doing bad things while they're drunk. This is you may or may not like Terence Irwin's translation, so I'm just going to work with his.
And Irwin is one of those guys who wants to push Aristotle towards, it's the will.
It's true, so I didn't bring my OCT, sorry,
for
us to look at it. But the way in which the discussion goes, and I think that the translation here is pretty sound, actually. They impose the the penalty in other like cases for any other ignorance that seems to be caused by the agent's inattention. They assume it is up to him not to be ignorant, since he controls whether he pays attention.
Yeah.
And still and they say, well, he's presumably the sort of person who isn't attentive, so he already has a disposition or character outside of his control. But Aristotle says still, he is himself responsible for becoming this sort of person because he has lived carelessly. So he's made prior choices. And so you can control what you attend to or not, but if you want to be sloppy or not, and you could, and in other passages talks about changing that and rehabilitating or getting friends to help you. I don't want to jump into the
there's a tendency sometimes to see that passage as similar to incontinence or akrasi or lack of self-control, and it's interesting because there's a and the problem with akrasi is, well, the person has prohairesis, they just don't follow it. So are they responsible for their not following it? On the account that I'm giving, I would say yes, that's yet another type of prohairesis, and the person who is careless in the way in which they take care of their character and winds up being sloppy and inattentive, they're responsible for that, even though in a certain sense they didn't strictly deliberate and say, I want to be the kind of person who does this. In the Poetics, Aristotle actually talks about the need, if you're going to make somebody inconstant, you need to make them reliably inconstant, which implies that even in inconstancy, there's a kind of determinative character that we can point to. And that would be, again, a matter of prohairesis. So, yeah.
Forgive me for the ill forming of this question. It's been a while since I've dived into the Aristotelian stuff. But I remember when I was reading the Nicomachean Ethics, when he's talking about, voluntary, he says, it's not, you can't be in a state of ignorance for something to be voluntary, right? If you're ordering something at a restaurant and I say something in a language you don't understand, you say, yeah, I'll have that. It's not really voluntary because you don't know, it could be a category. Right. And you can't be coercive if somebody's putting a gun to your head, it's not voluntary, right?
Yeah.
So, when talking about this prohairesis, you say it's a species of the voluntary, right?
That's the standard interpretation.
Oh, okay, standard interpretation. But I'm curious, and this is now anachronistic, but we have modern debates about compatibilism and libertarianism and all that. Just because you're not in a state of ignorance or not coerced doesn't mean you're free, though, right, in a libertarian sense. So, this Prohairesis, as an Aristotelian scholar, do you think, based on your reading of him, that he might have been, in his own inchoate, fuzzy way, leaning a little more towards libertarianism with this stuff, or more towards a compatibilism kind of thing? What do you think of that?
I think that, well, if I have to take a sort of definitive stand and place it within that framework, I would say that Aristotle is, you're going to have him be a libertarian, to some degree, because we are self-movers to some degree in that we choose our actions. Now, in a lot of areas, I think, especially when we look at the connection between the mind and the body, which is stuff more in the De Anima and the physical texts, he tends to analyze phenomena, particularly phenomena that are important to moral life, in terms of well, there's this physical level, and then there's this psychological level, and then a moral level. Yet, and he's not actually coming out and saying, "Here we shall distinguish the three levels" or anything like that. But you can see this in his text, and he recognizes there's some interaction. For example, he says once you get angry, his view of anger physically is it's blood stirring around the heart and boiling and all that. Once you actually do get angry, it's hard to stop yourself. Not only because we have natural tendencies to be jerks and think that we have we're right in being angry and by God I'm going to show that guy, but also because the blood's still boiling and moving around. So there is some element of compatibilism in his account. But I think that ultimately, and probably I'm going to get in trouble with other Aristotelians, he's got to be a libertarian on some level. As far as the ignorance and the compulsion goes, there's more voluntary stuff to that, because you get off the hook if you're ignorant, and you're ignorant of particulars. If you're ignorant because you're the kind of person who put yourself in, let's say you go to restaurants all the time and you order off of menus and you got no idea what it is, and that's your thing, No, you're responsible for that, right? Or the waiter comes.
Well, that's the
like,
habitual side, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Or, you know, or it could also be because you get a charge out of it, so it has to do with, you know, affectivity or something like that.
Right.
Or you want to, you're at a French restaurant, you don't know any French, you want to impress your date and like try to order something, and you're like, yeah, I'll take that, and it comes and it's something terrible that you don't want to eat. As far as the compulsion goes, Aristotle says that most of the cases that we think of compulsion are actually voluntary and involuntary. They're what he calls mixed actions. Because you don't choose to be placed in the situation where somebody holds a gun to your head, or his example is threatening your parents and children to get you to do some dishonorable deed. You know, there's always these forced choices. You do still choose, he says. You do still select an option, and in that respect it's voluntary, but you didn't choose to have somebody come along and say, if you don't do this, I'm going to do this terrible thing to you. So it is to some degree involuntary, but it's mixed, and he never really takes that back up. So apparently he doesn't consider it a big problem. It is a big problem for us.
There's only so much he could do in his time. He wrote a lot. But thanks, I appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah.
I get, in light of our keynote talk today, I was wondering if you saw any room for an issue like intuition when you're talking about we do make relevant moral choices displaying character on basis of habit, affectivity, without explicit process of practical reasoning. Is Aristotle opening up a possibility that at times we just have an intuitional awareness of right and wrong, and
Yeah, it's not like we have a faculty in the way that some intuitionists historically have made it out, you know. And it's not like, the reason I distrust the talk about intuitions is it's very leveling, you know, and it tends to efface our asking questions about, well, where exactly did you get these ideas of right and wrong that you're going with as gut instincts, you know? Are they the product of choosing the wrong thing, or, incorrectly ordering your desires and values in relation to each other, and then now you're just sort of going on that basis? Or is it, conversely, is it a product because of your self-discipline that you've been engaged in? And there is also this dimension of, for Aristotle, luck or fortune plays a role in it. If you wound up in the wrong culture, you're probably going to be morally incapacitated. You're going to have the wrong, what we call, intuitions. Particularly if you're one of those barbarians by the Black Sea, you're worse than a Persian then. He's got that whole anthropology, which is kind of quaint now. I don't like to use the word intuition, because then once you do, you open up the door to anything becomes an intuition, right?
Okay.
Did you have a question? Oh.
And it's like one that kind of piggybacks on what Don raised, because on your page, bottom 9 onto 10, it's a discussion about does it really have to be this intellectualist, or can it be affected? Do people really do this, this explicit process of practical reasoning? And I think there may be at least two things that could be said in response. One of them has to do with the fact that Aristotle says ideally the best person is going to be very deliberate and such, but that will come in really handy when you're in emergency situations and you have to choose out of what he calls second nature.
Yeah.
And so it looks like it's not been deliberated about, but you're relying on your own good cultivation. And so it looks like one of those, you're doing the right thing without thinking about it when actually you thought about it and you got yourself into the good habit. That could be one way he would respond to your suggestion here. The other one is that being the spoudios, or the phronimos, is really hard and very rare. And that the second... It
depends on the book. Yeah. They're all over the place.
Or it's relatively rare. And the second best is to have your wits enough about you to know to imitate the right person. And so you may not be... You may have a somewhat inchoate notion, like, wow, that person's really admirable, or life's going really well, and I'd like to emulate them because I don't have the time, or or whatever to think through, but there's some kind of, and maybe that's where the wiggle room for what you're suggesting and for Aristotle is when you say that do we have to have this explicit process of practical reasoning to enough of an extent on his account you would have to, but if you're imitating a morally virtuous person and you're counting on, you have to have good enough judgment to know to follow the right person.
And to reassess when you need to, too.
Yeah, exactly. That, wow, maybe I've been, going to go off the cliff with the wrong lemming. Or something. And so you have to then switch, then have enough wits about you to switch over. So at some point, on his view, it seems you have to have at least some modicum of the intellectualist account in order to have the judgment to do it. So even if not the full-blown. So your question is a good one. I'm just wondering where he would stop and the grounds on which he would stop. And say, well, no, it has to be explicit. It's at some point, at some juncture, for some length of time.
I don't think there's a hard and fast rule for that, and it will probably depend on the sort of moral quandaries and how difficult the situation of development is for the person. Looking at this really sort of big picture, broad project kind of stuff, what attracts me to virtue ethics is exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about. We're not virtuous, most of us. If we are, it's usually in respect of a few of the virtues and not all of them. We're always sort of like picking up the pieces of lives that we've managed to screw up so far and want to unscrew, to some degree. And I think that that's something that gets left out of virtue ethics, but that virtue ethics gives us lots of powerful tools for conceptualizing. I see that more in Christian virtue ethicists, particularly the monastic ones, because that was where their focus was, John Cassian or Anselm or Augustine to a certain extent. Aristotle wasn't concerned with all those sort of problems, but he was concerned with this. And I tend to look at virtue itself as something that's on a gradient. It often gets presented like an on-off switch, where look, you're either just or you're not, and now you've got this somewhere along the line, this thing got established in you, this hexis, and now you're A-OK all the time. I don't think that's what he's putting forth. Certainly when you start looking at where he's actually talking about real people, like the Athenian Constitution or the politics or the rhetoric, and he's bringing up actual people. He doesn't think that most of them they possess all the virtues, even if they have some of the virtues. Did I address it? Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I was just going to say that I think you did a really good job of showing how the standard interpretation is really limiting, because I was just thinking that it looks to me as though the standard interpretation of Prohairesis is subject to the same kind of critique against utilitarianism of the psychological demandingness of individual choices and the one thought too many kind of, the sort of intellectual acrobatics that you'd have to go through to make the right utilitarian choice.
Nobody ever really applies the prolific calculus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And since it's focused on choice, and like instances of choice instead of really patterns of choices, it seems really just sort of...
Yeah, Aristotle in the Politics, I think it's in book 7 or book 8, he says 3 things make us good. Logos, reason, or speech, however you want to translate that. Nature, physis, and then ethos, habit, character, this whole dimension of where we have to work on ourselves. And yeah, you're right. We couldn't possibly deliberate all the time. We'd go nuts. I see that criticism get raised against utilitarianism. I'm not a utilitarian myself, but I never like that criticism, because I don't think that Bentham or Mill or Sidgwick or people like that are actually saying we should do that every single time.
Mill explicitly takes on that challenge. Yeah. It's like the 9th counter example he takes on in book 2 of utilitarianism.
Right.
Yeah.
He goes, that's a straw man in my view.
Yeah, but I think some act utilitarians interpret it differently.
Well, he explicitly says that's not what we...
Right.
So Mill handles it head on.
Yeah, he tries to suck in virtue ethics so he can make that work.
He also said Jesus was a utilitarian.
Well, yeah, it's nice that you can get Jesus on your side. You want to get Jesus on your side and somehow have Hitler in your opponent's camp, and then the rhetorical battle is completely won.
Well, I'd like to thank Greg for a
Thanks.
very